facts are that there are cases of actual religious discrimination right here in Georgia because our government still treats freedom of religion as a second-class right. If you go to libertyinstitute.org, you can download a copy of this book I hold in my hand called Undeniable. It is a catalog, a survey of religious hostility in the country. In my hand is over 1,300 documented instances of religious hostility in this country. And I mean hostility towards religious individuals. You obviously know about the case of Atlanta Fire Chief Kelvin Cochran. He was fired for his faith. The city fired him not because he discriminated against anyone. Their own investigation exonerated him of any allegation of discrimination, but they fired him because he wouldn't check his beliefs at the door like one of the councilmen wanted him to do.
When you think about the world that George Orwell imagined in 1984, what happened in this case, if you look at the facts, it appears very clear. Chief Cochran published a book articulating his religious belief, including what I mentioned earlier about his view of sexuality that's informed by his faith. And as you say, the investigation revealed he treated all his employees fairly. He did not discriminate against anyone. But because his faith tradition may make someone uncomfortable, that makes it a fireable offense. Now, if you think about that, where that leads us is to a situation where people of faith, people of certain faiths, would need to theoretically hide their religious belief in order to protect their employment. Now again, that's not the country, that's not the state I think any of us want to live in. You know, in our country for decades, we had a test when you had a First Amendment free exercise claim and you said, you know, the government's doing something that's infringing on my religious liberty. We impose the highest possible standard on government, which makes sense. Right. That standard is a strict scrutiny standard that says only in a case where the government can demonstrate a compelling state interest and only where that compelling state interest can only be furthered by the strict application of that government policy are we going to run over your free exercise right.
The government should not have the power to compel us to act against our deeply held religious convictions without a very strong reason. This bill does not make religious observers to win any battle. It does not do anything but level the playing field. People will tell you, well, if you're a Christian and you have this bill, then you can do whatever you want. That's false.
And what RFRA is saying is that when government does that, we're going to tap the brakes. We're going to make them come forward and say, okay, you may be able to do that, but you've got to provide to us a compelling reason for doing so. And you've got to prove to us, not only was it compelling, but when you've substantially burdened someone's religious free exercise, you've got to also do so in the least restrictive means possible. Because religious liberty is of such great value in this country, we're going to say that it's going to trump almost every single other issue in this country.
That was the law for decades, and then in 1990, the United States Supreme Court vacated that test in a case called Employment Division versus Smith, and they went down to what's called a rational basis test, or what I like to tell people is the right for any reason test.
Under Smith, a government no longer has to justify burdens on the free exercise of religion as long as these burdens are merely the incidental effect of a generally applicable and otherwise valid provision. He's quoting there from the Smith decision. Religious liberty is damaged each day the Smith decision stands. Now, who was that mouthpiece of the Tea Party movement? Who was that grand far-right radical? It was the great senator from the state of Massachusetts, Ted Kennedy. Ted Kennedy himself believed that religious liberty is damaged each and every day the Smith decision stands. My friends, here in Georgia, religious liberty is damaged each and every day because the Smith decision still stands here.
It became very, very easy for the government to impose policies that could infringe on our religious liberty. And so something incredible happened in 1993. The United States Congress, Democrats and Republicans coming together, an incredibly diverse group of civil libertarian and religious groups, said we need to pass the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And what that bill did was simply return us to that very high, strict scrutiny standard.
By honoring the principle that our laws and institutions should not impede or hinder, but rather should protect and preserve fundamental religious liberties. The free exercise of religion has been called the first freedom, that which originally sparked the development of the full range of the Bill of Rights.
In 1993, when the federal RFRA, Religious Freedom Restoration Act, passed, it was nearly unanimous amongst Democrats and Republicans. A Democrat president signed it into law happily with a strong statement on religious freedom.
After the Congress passed that in 1993, there was a subsequent Supreme Court case that said the Congress can only regulate this legal standard for federal government action. So if you want to regulate state and local governments, state legislatures, you've got to act on your own. And so 31 states, either through legislative act or court decision, have imposed that higher standard, and that's what I want to do here in Georgia.
In 1998, the Illinois General Assembly, their state body, like this state body here in Georgia, passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Every one of the Illinois state senators voted for it, including State Senator Barack Obama, who is an Illinois state senator and voted for this same legislation.
What is troubling about this debate is that for centuries, as Americans, whether we were believers or non-believers, whether we consider ourselves on the right or the left, the principle of religious tolerance and religious liberty for all people was something that brought us together. And what I am disturbed about in this debate, you're always going to have groups on the fringe, but the fact that you've had certain business leaders who have weighed in on this debate on the side of oppressing people of faith, the fact that you've had other signs that bipartisan consensus is fraying is very dangerous.
That Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
Did you hear that? Exercise, not worship, not the four corners of a church, but the right to freely live out our faith in the public square, in the boardroom, in the courtroom, anywhere we go, we bring our faith with us.
Groups on the far left are just enraged because there's a divergence in what we think of when we think of the term religious liberty. When I think of that term, I think of the fact that outwardly 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, that I'm free in America and in the state of Georgia to practice my faith. People on the far left think that religious freedom is going to your designated house of worship on your designated holy day and having your religious experience there, but then when you walk out and you're in the public sphere, you can no longer practice your faith.
That doesn't mean, ladies and gentlemen, as the opponents will tell you, we have a blank check to do whatever we want in the name of religion. We don't. This law doesn't do that. This law imposes a simple balancing test that's been applied for over 75 years for first-class rights, rights like freedom of speech and the freedom of the press. We've got the right to that. It prevents abuses in the name of religion, and it balances core state interests against a person's freedom of religion.
But that doesn't mean the government's always going to lose under RFRA. In fact, it could be that the government will win because there are compelling interests like personal safety, public safety, the interest in health and welfare of our country and our citizens are of tantamount and paramount importance at times. Now, can government provide to us a compelling governmental interest for why they should do so? And can they prove that they've done that by the least restrictive means possible? If they can do those two things, then they can continue to act and so act in the public welfare or for the public safety or whatever it might be. But if they can't, then religious liberty is going to be proven to be much more effective than that, and much more important than whatever the compelling interest or not so compelling interest as the case may be advanced.
This bill does not pick winners or losers. All this bill does is provide a clear test in the law that's been used in this country for 75 years for critical issues like free speech and freedom of religion. The test is simple that if the government has a very real reason, a compelling government interest, the bill is narrowly tailored to meet that interest, then they can and in fact do restrict free speech and freedom of religion. But without that test, the government is entitled to do pretty much whatever it wants to whoever it wants and in the way they're acting on their faith. It is also the right that gives the hand and feet to a broader right that is also under attack, freedom of conscience. Freedom of conscience protects the inalienable right to think and believe what we wish without fear of punishment.
Georgia deserves to have their own Religious Freedom Restoration Act to protect our citizens from any more religious discrimination that we see taking place across our state.
We are not required to think what the city wants us to think.
We must be freedom fighters for this generation. We're living in a day when the government is trying to intrude upon our freedom of religion.
This is our fundamental right to free exercise of religion under attack.
The government is threatening the church to not live, listen, as we believe our religion gives us, or our faith, but we can't take it outside the church. We can't live our conscience in the marketplace or where we work or where we live.
But when you have the facts on your side, you argue the facts. When you've got the law on your side, you argue the law. We don't have either on your side, you just argue the loudest. Or as some people say, you make things up. That's what opponents of this bill are doing. They're arguing loud and they're making things up, plain and simple. A prominent lawyer published his opinion that this religious freedom bill is, and I quote from his letter, unequivocally an excuse to discriminate, close quote. That is one of the most bald-faced lies about this bill that's been bandied about for over a year now. What's truly amazing about this perpetually repeated falsehood is that not once in his opinion was there a single reference to a legal ruling where religious freedom excused discrimination. Not one. And what makes it even more ridiculous, I've been asking for a case like that for a year. And how many have they come up with? Zero. And they're not going to come up with one because this is not an excuse to discriminate unless you're discriminating against Christians. It stops it, dead in its tracks.
But the opponents of this legislation, the things that they're saying that the legislation could potentially do, there are 31 states that have this in place. Federal government's had it in place for 22 years. And the opponents cannot point out to one reported case to support their claims. Right. So I have to agree with him that there really is no evidence out there to support the claims that they're making.
This is a negative right that restricts government action. But a negative right, I mean it's a limitation on government's ability to force its citizens, people like me and you, to act against our conscience. There should be only very limited circumstances where a government can punish you for what you believe. And this test makes it so that there has to be very, very specific and detailed reasons for why the government ought to punish you for the way you think and believe. Without this test, the government has the ability to punish you for any reason it deems to be appropriate. That's wrong. People have the misperception that this allows private businesses to discriminate against private individuals. It simply does not.
If a constitutional guarantee is not sufficient, then what is this bill, this statute, going to do that our Constitution doesn't do? Hobby Lobby and Conestoga Wood were not able to get around the Obamacare forced abortion mandate with the First Amendment. They wouldn't have been able to do it. They had to use RFRA, the federal version of RFRA. And all SB 129 is the federal language. There was a t-shirt shop in Lexington, Kentucky that did not want to print a message on a t-shirt that offended the owner of the t-shirt company. And the local government attacked, fined, harassed the local t-shirt company. Down in Florida, Lake Worth, Florida, where the local government has decided to start harassing churches about business licenses. They're nonprofits, but they're going after them with business licenses. The Equal Protection Clause does trump the First Amendment, the way the courts have held equal protection jurisdiction.
If you look outside of Georgia, look at states where someone in a detention facility was denied the opportunity to be counseled by his priest, by the heavy hand of government. I mean, are these really the sorts of things that should be happening in a truly free society? I would say no. What I would say to those that say that the current protections are enough, I would say that to the students in the Christian Legal Society at Savannah State University who were disbanded for having a foot washing ceremony on campus. Say that to the student at Sutton Middle School that wanted to be able to study the Bible during off study hours and was told repeatedly that he could not. Say it to the students on the football team at Chestatee High School up in Hall County who were having voluntary student-led prayer before football practice and were told that that was something that could not be allowed. And if someone finds that offensive in our country, they have every right to find it offensive. They have every right to speak out against it if they think it's offensive. What they don't have the right to do is to aggregate the power of government to drive people of faith that hold those beliefs from the public square. It's totally wrong, it's anti-American, and that is why we're seeing it happen all over our state, which is why we need this heightened legal protection for every person of faith.
And that's why RFRA is needed, because the First Amendment would say to those same laws, well, we don't need to tap on the brakes at all, because the First Amendment just says you've got to be able to provide a law that is neutral towards religion and that is applicable to everybody. That's it. And so there are cases when the interest is not so high that the First Amendment would approve of the government acting outside of their proper sphere. But what RFRA does is to reorient that test back to say, okay, you've got to give us a reason why you're doing this, and it's got to be a really, really good reason. And you've got to show to us that you have done as little bit of damage to religious liberty as possible. That's all that RFRA does.
Religious discrimination by the city of LJ, an important city to one of the members in this House, requiring organizers of a prayer chain to get a permit before being allowed to peaceably assemble on a sidewalk for quiet prayer. Religious discrimination in the city of Pine Mountain, denying Christians the right to put free Bibles in a public library where all kinds of other free literature was put out. Why? Because there was a separation of church and state. No, free exercise of religion is a fundamental right that must be protected. I represent Christians all over Georgia who face actual religious discrimination. The opponents of this bill, they just make things up.
You see, folks, I cannot bring you Dr. Walsh today because he cannot find a job in the United States of America in his field right now. Today he is on the island of Guam as a medical missionary because he has been shown the door by the Department of Public Health here in the state of Georgia.
There's going to be a societal consensus on what religious beliefs you can hold, and if you go outside of that societal consensus, those of us in the majority are going to use the awesome power of government to punish you. And that's why we need these protections in the law so that people can fight back through the judicial process.
If that is not enough for you to understand why the need for a RFRA exists, why there is the need for this Preventing Government Overreach on Religious Expression Act is needed, if these 1,300 and growing documented instances of religious liberty is not enough, if my friend Dr. Eric Walsh is not sufficient for you to understand the need to protect religious liberty in this country, and if Chief Cochran's story is not enough for you to understand it, then my friends, I'm not sure what left to say. Ladies and gentlemen, unless you and I are willing to stand up for religious liberty, we will soon lose it.
Lord, I am here today because some very powerful and vocal groups have been working day and night to silence not just preachers and pastors, but the people of Christ and the gospel of Christ. They have lied. They have slandered and vilified good people in this state, good people of Christ, and the gospel of Christ.
I think there's such a desperation on the side of the opposition to this bill that they're looking to throw anything and everything they can. For 8 months, it was this so-called license to discriminate. Then in the last month, we've heard the child abuse allegation. Now the attempt to link this legislation in some way with racial unrest in the South is absolutely ridiculous. You know, when you look at the Western legal tradition, I'm talking to you here in 2015, 800 years ago, King John signed the Magna Carta, which had the first guarantee of religious freedom in it. For the entire time since 1215, Western nations have always had the strongest possible religious liberty protection because we understand what happens when all people of faith are not respected. You wind up with societies like Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, North Korea. You wind up with totalitarian states where the government decides what belief system is acceptable and what belief system is not acceptable. I know that we don't want to go down that road in our country, and people say, oh, well, you know, it's a solution in search of a problem. But what I would say to you is, we don't lose fundamental rights overnight. We lose them by degree, and we lose them when we stop taking them seriously. And so that's why this debate is so important to me, because I believe Georgians deserve the same protection that 31 other states have, and again, that inmates in federal prisons have.
Our country was founded by people that were fleeing government oppression of religion. That's why they got on the Mayflower. We need to have a government that respects that free exercise of religion that we've had for over 200 years. And unfortunately, the state of Georgia does not have that kind of government. We do not have those kind of representatives. We do not have that kind of leadership. We have leadership that enjoys persecuting believers because they don't like what believers say and do. And that's wrong. It ought not to be.
Hugo Black of the Supreme Court of the United States announced that those 9 black-robed judges had somehow come to the conclusion that open, voluntary public prayer in the public schools was no longer acceptable and unconstitutional. The next year, as a result of the Shemp decision, Bible reading was basically dismantled in the public schools. In 1965, the Supreme Court ruled that you could no longer pray over your meal in a public school cafeteria. In 1980, they said you could not post the Ten Commandments on the walls of your school, either in the classrooms or the hallways. And then in 1986, September the 25th, the Atlanta Constitution revealed on its front page that a federal judge had issued a restraining order banning prayers before football games over in Douglas County High School. And then in 1987, creationism could no longer be taught according to Supreme Court ruling.
I refuse to sit idle by and remain silent while our religious liberty continues to be taken away from us.
Our forefathers have fought and died for us to have this right.
Listen, in light of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, how can you do anything less than to pass the Religious Liberty Bill?
Remember the God of Martin Luther King Jr., the Lord of Martin Luther King Jr., Jesus Christ. Holy Spirit, I ask you to support the Religious Liberty Bill with no amendments, people. No amendments.
Just awaken a sleeping giant.
They need to pass the bill. We need to pass this bill because we have the right to freely live out our faith without fear of punishment. Let the politicians in this building hear that you want the bill passed without amendment, without being watered down.
It is time for us to wake up, get up, stand up, speak up, and lift up our voice like a trumpet and say, we want our religious freedom restored and preserved.
If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves, pray, and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven, will forgive their sin, and will heal their land.